In 2008, NASA took the song Across the Universe by the Beatles and beamed it at the speed of light toward Polaris, the North Star. It's going to take that transmission 431 years to reach its destination. But my dream is that the signal will be intercepted by alien life forms who will think the Beatles' music is really groovy, and they'll come to Earth in search of peace and love and a good time. Let me invite you to travel back in time with me, back to 1964, an unassuming little year right between President Kennedy's assassination and the ramping up of the Vietnam War. Guys were cool, hairdos were big, cars were enormous, and rock and roll music was over. Chuck Berry was in jail. Elvis Presley got drafted. Little Richard found the Lord and renounced rock and roll. Jerry Lee Lewis married his 13-year-old cousin. Buddy Holly was dead. Kids were listening to artists like Fabian and Paul Anka and Pat Boone. Like I said, rock and roll music was over. The #1 album in February 1964 in America was The Singing Nun. But then came the Beatles. John, Paul, George, and Ringo, the Fab Four. And they reminded us why we love and need rock and roll music, why rock was going to be the soundtrack of the 20th century, probably the most tumultuous 100 years since the dawn of hominid life forms. The Beatles played Sullivan and then toured the US, and they brought energy and ideas and intelligence to rock and roll. And being from Great Britain, the Fab Four also experienced some 1964 culture shock, especially in the South. Now, this was the Jim Crow South. Racial segregation, Brown versus the Board of Education, tear gas, protests, Strom Thurmond. The Beatles were booked to play to 32,000 screaming fans at the Jacksonville, Florida Gator Bowl. Now, this was to be a racially segregated concert, just like a lot of music shows at that time. White kids over here, African American kids over there. But the Beatles said, we're not going to play this show unless it's general admission. Rhythm guitarist John Lennon said, we have never played to a segregated audience, and we're not going to start now. Now, this was a really controversial stance. These know-it-all Brits coming over here and telling Southerners how to run their businesses. This was a time when even many African-American artists performed to whites-only crowds. You know, I wonder if anyone would have, at that time, would have even criticized the Beatles if they had just played to the segregated audience and caved to the status quo. But after all, this was the British invasion. The Stones, the Kinks, the Who, the Yardbirds, the Troggs, etc. And invading countries get to bring with them new ideas and new concepts. Ultimately, the Beatles got their way. The doors of the Gator Bowl were open to kids of all colors to sit wherever they wanted. Imagine, no, not yet. Don't imagine yet. Trust me, if you were a venue owner in '64, you wanted the Beatles. You would cave to their demands. Imagine if the first band you got to see while sitting in the front row was the Beatles. In the early 1960s, a lot of people left politics to the politicians. The Beatles definitely got there first. You know, now it seems that a lot of kid pop singers advocate for a lot of causes on the side, but in the early 1960s, this was a definitely revolutionary act. See, the Beatles knew a secret, and I'm going to share it with you. They could see the future. They knew that tomorrow does not necessarily resemble today. They knew that a new future was just as likely as an outdated yesterday. But most of all, they knew that 1964 was not going to last forever. These people thought 1964 was going to last forever, and they were wrong. It's very simple to live in a static universe, but it takes a lot of brain capacity to navigate a world that is evolving. So back to NASA and that song Across the Universe by the Beatles, traveling at the speed of light toward Polaris. In 2008, former Beatle Paul McCartney gave the space agency a message that said, "Well done, NASA, send my love to the aliens." Now, I've thought for many years about the moment when mankind finally contacts extraterrestrial life, and what a paradigm shift that would be for most sentient life forms on Earth, that we are not alone, that technology can be used for peaceful exploration of the universe. But when we finally do contact extraterrestrial life forms, I'm glad most of all that the Beatles got there first.